Production folder walkthrough. Wow. Take two, because I forgot to turn my microphone on the first time. Whoops. The first part of the production folder is the essay. This is a pretty comprehensive walkthrough of the decision making process here. All of the health and safety considerations are covered in this essay. For the sake of time, I don't want to repeat any of this. I am going to briefly mention the risk assessments, but most of it, again, is covered in here. So that's where I'm going to gloss through that. Most of what I talk about in this review, this vlog, is going to be the smaller technical details, stuff that didn't really fit with the essay, with the framing of it. So, in terms of risk assessments and health and safety files, most of the hazards come from conventional filming hazards: warm lights, set construction, fatigue, long working hours, access egress. Proper PPE has to be worn. Make sure that there's no loose cables, no trip hazards. Make sure that nothing's being allowed to sort of set-wise be loose. Make sure there's no falling objects. Make sure there's no loose surfaces, etc., etc. This is all covered in the risk assessment. The main area of concern with the risk assessment was the tower and the tunnel filming, because these are very specialized types of equipment. They have all sorts of their own regulation they need to adhere to. In order to streamline that process, I decided very early on that we wouldn't be building the climbing wall or the tunnels for the sets. We'd be bringing them in from elsewhere. So the climbing wall especially, it was very important that I found a properly certified, fully checked and tested indoor climbing wall rental company that could bring a pop-up climbing wall in a van, set it up there. We build the set around it. The set's not touching the climbing wall. The set's just kind of around the climbing wall. And then they're responsible for the safety of that. Well, not responsible, but they've made sure that that's safe, and we've not tampered with it at all. This is really important because I don't build climbing walls, so I have to make sure that I've just had that climbing wall vetted by experts who do build climbing walls. In terms of regulation for it, there are European standards for how much load bearing the climbing wall has to endure. We will be testing the wall ahead of time during the rig section, so we'll make sure that it fits those requirements. There's also requirements for the materials and the amount of padding that has to be around the climbing wall. We'll be testing that as well, making sure that the padding is all there, so that there's no risk of damage if someone falls off or anything like that. Everyone using the climbing wall will be properly harnessed up in full body harnesses. There are concerns with children and semi-body harnesses, shoulder or waist harnesses, about load bearing on their skeletal structure. A full body harness avoids that concern. It makes sure they're fully supported in all areas, and that there isn't an uneven distribution of pressure going through that child if they do end up putting their weight on the harness or falling off. Each child will be given a supervisor, a climbing instructor, who will be fully checked and background checked, qualified in climbing instruction. The instructor will be given time to brief the children ahead of the climb as well. This just means that the children are constantly under supervision. With each child having their own supervisor, we haven't got to worry about the supervisors distributing their attention and potentially becoming distracted, which is a risk that could happen if we had a single instructor across all children. It's also just necessary for the premise of the event, of the challenge, that each child needs to have a supervisor. More on that later on, though. Concerns-wise for the tunnel, the main ones for visibility, making sure that there's no sharp corners or sudden drops that could cause a child to stumble, to trip, to hit themselves on a surface. Making sure that surfaces were padded to a degree that was safe. Not strictly necessary, but I wanted to take that precaution just in case. And also making sure that the tunnels are properly ventilated, because they are enclosed spaces. They can get very, very warm, especially in a studio environment where you have a warehouse with all the lighting above it and all. So had to make sure that there's proper ventilation in the tunnels as and when needed, and also that egress is provided so that in the event of an emergency or a fire, the child can very quickly be evacuated from that tunnel without having to go all the way back through. So things like panels will be put in place to quickly take out sections of a tunnel and just remove a child from it safely. It also helps with the actual filming itself, because the tunnel section will require that props be put throughout the tunnel. So having accessible sections just makes it easier to put their props in place. It means that the filming process can be streamlined. So the entire thing is improved. The entire process is improved by having accessible tunnel entry points. Other health and safety hazards are anything associated with films. I've already gone through most of them. These are also on the risk assessment, so I'm not going to spend too much time covering these here now. Beyond the risk assessment, there's the production schedule. This I'm going to cover in a bit of depth because it's not mentioned in the essay. You might notice that there aren't many production staff involved. There's a production coordinator, manager, line producer, and production secretary, but that's about it. I noticed this is a deliberate choice. I noticed that in a lot of children's game shows, the production team was quite skeletal, quite slim. So I sort of thought, well, if everyone else is doing it, I'm not going to spend extra budget bringing on more production staff, because it's about £700 per day of production staff if you do bring on more. So to strip down the budget a bit more, I went with this very small style of production team, just going with what's necessary, because this is not really it's a game show, but it's not really a quiz show, so it doesn't require a huge amount of research or coordination, so you haven't got to have producers to do that. There's just no need to have loads and loads of producers when we could just have a few. On a similar note, there won't be many researchers. There might be a single researcher and no other ones on the project, because as I mentioned before, we're leaning more into the challenge aspect and the tunneling and climbing aspect of the show than the quiz. So there aren't really going to be any quiz questions that need research for. Most of the research will be around like the backgrounds of the contestants, and then kind of, I guess the research will be doing some of the research on the area. I don't know. The research is not going to have much to do on this project, really, but we might as well have one just in case. Camera-wise, there's going to be 3 cameras. Each one has its own operator. Only one sound operator, because the multi-track recorder can be used by a single person. And there's not going to be any booms involved, so there's no need for a boom operator. All there will be is the 8 lavalier mics and 2 fixed microphones for the audience, so there's no need to have somebody actively operating that. In terms of pre-production, a priority here was making sure that we had time to DBS check and safeguarding train all the crew. There's a good chance they'll already have DBS checks and safeguarding training, but we want to make sure, just to tick that box really, and just for the sake of liability, that we've also given a full DBS check and full safeguarding courses to all the members involved, to make sure that the children are safe and to make sure that the crew thoroughly know the policies that are in place to protect those children. So for this sake, all the crew had to be sourced on week 2. That gave us week 3 to brief them. On week 3, we also wanted to find the accommodation and the equipment. This stuff was kind of a lower priority. There are lots of hotels and lots of kit stores around the studio that we chose. One of the reasons we chose it. So I didn't need to give really more than a week for this. There was always going to be space available in these things. Insurance is essential. I'll go more into detail on the insurance policy later on. That was week 1, because you need to have insurance throughout the entire production process. Risk assessments as well was important. Licensing for children and also licensing for the body of persons approval, which is being used for the audience, was very important. So that was week 1. That can also take a long time in some cases, so it just gives it the full 3 weeks before the filming to iron out or do any negotiations that need to be done. Contracts are week 1, because you need contracts for everyone that's being brought into the project, so you can't bring on the crew until you have the contracts ready. Recce, week 2. The studio is similar kind of thing to the accommodation and the kit. There were a couple of studios that I had in mind, so there wasn't a hugely immediate precedent to organise one. So the booking of a studio could be left until the 3rd week. What couldn't be after the 3rd week, however, was the editing. Editing suites are hard to find, so I made sure that the edit suite and the post-production suite were booked 3 weeks in advance to make sure they're locked in. In terms of the filming day itself, I wanted to provide breakfast. This just meant that I could bring the crew in the day before, make sure they're fully rest before the shoot, that no one is fatigued. And this is important because we were going to be shooting all day. The show would have cutaway scenes and challenge scenes. I wanted the cutaway scenes to be filmed in the first half of the day so that we could just focus on the challenges later on. This also meant that we could reduce the amount of studio space we need, as you can bring down the cutaway sets and put up the challenge sets. But for this to work, the crew has to be ready very early, so it was important the crew had breakfast provided, so that they had the energy, so that they had that those calories to burn. I gave 2 hours for cutaway shoots. This is kind of a safety zone. There aren't many. Realistically, there'll be like perhaps one cutaway per game where they introduce what the challenge is, and there'll be an intro and an outro cutaway. Since all the sets are going to be pre-built during the rig setup, all that needs to be done is the camera has to be moved across and the camera angle needs to be found. So feasibly, quite a bit of time can be taken out of here, but I wanted to give some leeway just so there's that flexibility in the schedule. Lunch is provided by the catering. Catering-wise, it was important that I had a selection of vegan, gluten-free, and non-vegan options, just so that everyone was catered for. So I made sure that when I was choosing my catering supplier, that all these boxes were ticked. I also wanted to make sure with the catering that warm food was provided, because a crew can get by on just cold sandwiches, but it's nice. It's good for morale to have warm food. So at the breakfast there'll be some warm food, and at lunch also there'll be some warm food. D-rig and rig-wise, I gave a lot of time for this. This just allows us to set up the climbing tower, set up all the climbing harnesses, all the equipment, all the challenge sets. It'll be quite a big rig, so as much time as that was needed there as possible. In terms of children filming, the audience segment went first, just so that the part with the most children gets out of the way very quickly. This means you haven't got to have a bunch of children hanging around. We get them in and out as soon as we can, so we just have the minimal, forced people for the contestants. The children filming is all happening after school hours. This is very important because licensing takes this into account. If you try to film over school hours, councils don't like that. It might delay the licensing process. They might deny the license altogether. So I had to make sure that the filming was happening in the evening, but before 10 p.m. so the children weren't being kept up too late. In terms of call sheet, not a huge amount of things to say here. This is just a call sheet. Actors and such were arriving in advance of filming, so they had time to do makeup, time to have their costumes put on, all the rest of it. You might notice for some of the camera crews and some of the rigging crews, etc., that the call time is shorter than what's been budgeted for. This is just a safety precaution, so that in the budget there's a little bit of leeway there in case anything comes up. Obviously, we're not going to keep the staff for longer than they've been scheduled for, because that has problems with unionisation and such. But the idea is that if we need to make up money elsewhere, some funding can be taken out of the crew budget. It's just a little bit, not loads, but just small amounts here and there that ultimately add up and become quite useful. The premise of the show is fairly straightforward. It's an island. There's a despot who's taken over. The original citizens, who are played by the audience, have been kicked off and are banished to a cargo ship, sort of Waterworld D's style. The 4 children have to kind of go in and save the day. They have to depose this tyrannical leader and restore the island to the citizens who should rightfully live there. There'll be 4 challenges that facilitate this. The first is a tunneling section where they have to find 3 totems to sort of access a secret entrance to a 4th tunnel through a volcano to get to the resistance base so they can start helping the freedom fighters. Second challenge is an archive challenge. They're faced with a bunch of doors, like a vault, and they have to find in this vault these schematics for the castle so they can break in and try and do some espionage. This is going to be the audience section, so it'll be a kind of hot-cold game where the audience know where the schematics are, but the competitors don't. So the competitor gets one chance to open the door, and the audience has to kind of guide them the correct way. To help coordinate the audience and help guide them, there will be a member of the cast who'll be dressed as a kind of cargo ship captain, and they'll act as a sort of spokesperson for them. So if the contestant seems a bit confused, the spokesperson, the cargo ship captain, will give some advice and sort of say, "Oh, maybe it's that way." Guide the audience on what to say, guide the competitor on where to go. Just provide a bit of order and a bit of structure to it. The third challenge is Kitchen in Cahoots. This is semi-team based, or the competitors have to describe food items one another. They can't say what the item is. They have to try and find the correct one. If they are unable to each find 4 correct items based on descriptions, then each one gets disqualified. The idea for this is that they've got into the castle and now they're in a diplomatic lunch and they're trying to extract information or spy on the aristocrats or whatever. So they have to keep them appeased and make sure that the appearances are kept up during this banquet. Just a little sort of filler idea. The ultimate challenge is Tower of Turmoil. This is a big climax. It involves a tower. 4 children are climbing up the tower. This is a team-based game, so it was very important to me that a good moral message is being sent, and I think the idea of teamwork is quite a useful one. So the idea behind this is that the children will each be able to help each other. So as they're climbing the tower, there'll be little switches and buttons that they can press, which will give the other competitor, or the other children, boosts up the tower. In practice, what this means is each child with their climbing instructor will have a hoist, and when one of the boost buttons is pressed, the climbing instructor with that hoist will wait for a safe opportunity and then will pull the child up, give them a little boost. Doing it with an instructor rather than using a machine just means that we have that judgment, we have that decision-making process where we can say, okay, it's safe to give a boost now, or okay, it's not safe to give a boost now. Let's wait a little bit until the child's stable and then boost them up, which is a really important health and safety precaution. It also means that the instructor can say in advance to the child when they're being boosted, give them a bit of warning so the child can prepare themselves, which again is a really important health and safety precaution for this event, which could be quite dangerous if not properly regulated. On the subject of regulation, this is this is all mentioned in the essay, but the climbing regulations, very important, locked behind paywalls. This is sort of an aside now, but I think in the future, as a piece of module feedback, if you are using this brief again, it would be nice to see these climbing regulations put onto the university library, because I think I can't remember how much 12.572 costs, but I know 11.76, which is the tunneling one or the soft play center one, costs about 230 quid to gain access to, which is a bit outside the budget for most students doing this sort of projects. So I wasn't able to get as much information on climbing and on tunneling as I had liked to. And I think it's a useful piece of documentation for any student to have for this brief, right? So if we are using it again, if possible, it would be very nice to see this regulation, all 3 parts of it ideally, put onto the university reading list, and possibly EN 1176 as well. Although 1176 is more, it's a broader in scope. It's not specifically about tunnels, so it's not as relevant. It's a bit of a stretch, really. But 12.572 is very, very useful for this particular module. So, as a recommendation, I think getting that on the reading list would be hugely useful. Please. In terms of studio, I went with one called 3 Mills. This is in London. They have a really robust environmental policy. This is a big part of the appeal. They have full coverage for sustainable energy, certified sustainable energy, and they've got proper set recycling facilities that they provide. They also provide their own unit base, which is really useful. That has, again, a renewable electric hookup, renewable gas hookup. Just helps keep the carbon footprint down as much as possibly can be. The set recycling in particular was a big part of this because the sets are quite elaborate. A lot of materials going into the set construction, a lot of budgets go into the set construction as well. So I wanted to make sure that we were disposing of that set in a very sustainable way. Steps were being taken to keep the set sustainable. So, for example, we used recycled MDF or engineered wood. mixed timber, whatever you want to call it, sort of same thing, that has a very low carbon footprint. If allowed to reach its full end of life cycle, it can actually be carbon negative. In the case of sets, it's unlikely that will happen. Obviously, there are set recycling facilities on this studio, and if the show is picked up for additional episodes, we can reuse the same sets again. But in the context of a single production, it will still create emissions, but it'll create considerably fewer emissions than if we had used non-recycled MDF or conventional timber. There are health and safety risks associated with MDF. It contains formaldehyde, it releases volatile organic compounds. These are carcinogens and ketone compounds, which can cause respiratory problems in the long term. But this can be managed. There are formulas, I forget who came up with them, but I have got them referenced in the bibliography. There are formulas you can use to calculate safe exposure levels. These will be really important when working with the sets, when designing them and building them. It'll be ensured that all exposure levels for formaldehyde and for the volatile organic compounds and the MDF will be kept well below the safe threshold, so that no risk of extra damage is being made. And where MDF is being worked with, whether it's being cut or shaped and glued together, there'll be full PPE worn, protective masks, gloves, clothing, the rest of it. Really important that was part of the health and safety policy. In regards to health and safety policy, I'll talk about this a little bit more now. The policy that I'm going to put in place is the BBC policy. So I pitched the idea to CBBC, in part because they have a portfolio of shows that are very similar to this in the past, but also because the BBC has really robust child protection policies and really robust technical standards, very robust health and safety policies too. So pitching to the CBBC means that I can use those same policies and apply those same policies in this project as well. These are policies that have been written up by countless industry experts. They've been revised countless times. They're to a much higher standard than anything I'd be able to come up with on my own. So it makes sense to infer as much as possible from these policies. I took a similar approach to carbon mitigation. We'll get onto that later on. I've got sort of distracted about carbon dioxide in the studio section. I'm jumping ahead here. Back to studio, logistics is really important. I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of hotels nearby. There are 2 major hotels. There's a Travelodge and there is a Holiday Inn Express. Both of these are more or less in the same spot. They're both accessible by this bus, the D8, which runs throughout the night and throughout the day. Really important that I had a bus that ran late and ran early as well, so that the accommodations are always accessible. Proximity to police stations and hospitals also critical. I found the nearest police station, nearest hospitals. They're both very close, but also children's hospitals are really important because there are children involved. So I wanted to make sure that there was a children's hospital, ideally within 5 miles. There was not. The nearest one was 6 miles away. As a precaution against this, I brought on a accident and emergency ambulance for the shoot. This just means that if anything happens with the children, or with any member of crew really, but especially with the children, there was always immediately something on site that we could get them to stabilize them while we brought them, or while we had ambulance sent over from the children's hospital. So that was a really important policy, given that it was just out of the ideal range of 5 miles. 6 miles still isn't huge. It's still very, very close, but it's a bit more than 5 miles, so it's just essential that we take that extra precaution, having the ambulance on site at all times. Equipment-wise, I chose my equipment based on suppliers that had been used by the BBC before, equipment that meets the kind of BBC technical guidelines in terms of resolution and color quality, all the rest of that. Not much to say about this. GoPro Heroes, I wanted GoPros because then I can have a camera on board the children while they climb or tunnel, just to get that angle, because I think that's quite an important angle to have. The Hero 11 specifically, 11 and above, but especially the 11, because that's quite a good battery life, has timecode sync on it. I don't think there's one of the more recent ones that hasn't got timecode sync on it, but the 11 definitely does. Timecode sync was a huge part of this because I haven't got a vision mixer on the shoot. That's all being done in the edit. I had to make sure that the time code for all the footage was exactly synchronized to the frame, that the audio was synchronized as well, just so that in the edit I haven't got to constantly worry about resynchronizing things. It just helps smooth things out and makes it that bit easier and quicker when we come to the edits. Here are timecode syncs. 9 of them, one for each one for each camera, one for the sound recorder. As you would expect, a pretty typical setup. In terms of audio, most of it's being done by clip-on lavalier mics. There will be 2 shotgun microphones to capture the audience in the audience segment, but the rest of it will be done with lavalier mics. This means that I haven't got to worry about having a microphone boom, which could get in the way. It also just means that the logistics work a lot better, because with the climbing section and with the tunneling section, there's not really a great way to get a microphone boom in there. Certainly with the tunneling section, having a microphone boom in the tunnels creates huge problems with visibility, with obstacles, with health and safety, so it's important that we have the lavalier mics instead, just so that we don't have to worry about that and dealing with it. Sets-wise, most of the sets will be designed to look like kind of ornate castles. There's not much to say about that, really. It's up to the design team to come up with the specifics here. Mentioned the MDF. I mentioned that earlier about the formulas that will be used to make sure exposure levels are kept under control. Insurance-wise, very important that I had full insurance coverage. Budget up to 70 grand. So the budget for the project is 70,000. The actual spending comes to about 58,000 before VAT. But I wanted to make sure that I had the full coverage that I would, as much as I could possibly need for it. Kit damage up to £3,000. The hired kit comes to about £2,500. So that's where that figure came from. Public liability, really important. Ignore the typo, because there's an audience involved. There are children competing involved. This is essential. If you've got anyone in the audience, anyone in the public, you need to have liability to cover them. Up to £5 million. It's quite a good figure. It's sort of the there's no option between 5 and 10 million, so I think 5 million is a good option, because it's not the lowest. The lowest is like 1 million from the provider that I took, but it also isn't the highest, because ultimately we're filming for one day, not that much damage that can happen in one day, so I think 5 million is a good figure for it. Producer's indemnity is also really important. This basically means that anything that happens which is outside the producer's control, so any sort of data handling issue, we have got a data handler on the call sheets and on the budget. But if there's any kind of issue with that, or any issue with the kit before it arrives, the producer's not liable for that. It's just a protection, just helps make sure that there's no additional risk being taken on where it can be avoided. Mentioned the carbon action plan before. Well, I mentioned the carbon policy, but carbon action plan, same thing. Most of our carbon mitigation methods are being based on this intervention plan, which was written up by 2 BBC research and development heads who are part of the carbon management sort of team there. Like I said earlier about child protection policies, this is just really, if the BBC's written it, there's no point trying to change it. Might as well apply the same thing. Essentially what it boils down to is keeping things local wherever possible, so there's minimal transport requirement, which we did. The transport emission on our production was very low compared to the average. The average is about 16 tons per hour of television. The one on my program came to less than 5 because everything was so local and there was so little transport involved. Making sure that materials are being used in the most sustainable way. Again, recycled MDF, etc. Sets recycled after the studio. It's just making sure that things aren't causing long-term damage or long-term impacts. Green energy is important. The studio that we're using has certified green energy supply. Mentioned this before. I'm sort of repeating myself a bit here, so I'm going to gloss over that. The budget, it's a budget. As I mentioned, most of this comes from the set construction, which, as you can see, that's making up a pretty massive chunk, 28.65 thousand, which is almost half of the entire production budget. Actually, it might be slightly more. I can't do maths. No, it's not quite. It's almost half. Just a little bit under half of the entire production budget. This is kind of a one-time payment. If there were subsequent shoots, we could reuse the same set. So if this were a 6-episode season or a 10-episode season, the per episode figure would be much lower. But because it's just for 2 episodes, the per episode figure is quite high. It's about £30,000 before VAT. After VAT, it's just over, but I'm not so concerned about that because with it being a corporate asset, there'd be a VAT rebate on it. So haven't really got to consider that as a real figure. It's this one that I'm looking at most of the time. Yeah, not a huge amount of production staff being brought on, as I mentioned, because it's just not necessary for a competitor-driven show. There's not a huge amount of on-shoot production that I think needs to be done beyond production coordination and the line producer / director. So yeah, that's everything in the production folder. I'm gonna have to wrap things up now. Goodbye.